I've been driving long haul for years, mostly across open stretches of road that could lull you to sleep if you aren't careful. But the Nevada desert at night, there's something about it that's just still. So when I started picking up weird static on my CB radio around 3 a.m., I brushed it off at first, probably just interference. But then I heard a voice, a woman, sounding young, maybe early 20s, if I had to guess. "Hello? Is anybody out there?" Her voice cut through the static, low and shaky. It startled me. Not many folks use CBs these days, and the voice had a raw, desperate tone to it. I reached for the radio, replying with, "Yeah, I'm here. What's going on?" "Oh, thank God." Her voice quivered like she was on the verge of crying. "My truck broke down at a stop about 10 miles ahead. I've been stranded here for hours." I checked my GPS. The next marked stop was still a good 30 minutes away, and as far as I knew, it had been closed for years. But I didn't mention that to her. Desert nights could play tricks on the mind, and maybe she'd gotten lost. "All right," I replied. "I'll be there in a bit. Just hang tight." As I continued down the road, the signal went in and out, her voice dipping into static. Each time she sounded more panicked. "I don't know how much longer I can wait," she whispered at one point, almost like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "There's something wrong here." "Something wrong?" I asked. The line went silent. Then the static picked up again, louder, filling my cab. I turned the volume down, but even that didn't completely drown out the faint sounds behind the hiss. When her voice finally returned, it was hushed, just above a whisper. "You don't understand. You need to hurry." The closer I got, the thicker the tension felt in the cab, pressing down on me like the weight of a storm about to break. I almost thought about turning around, but then her voice came through again, more desperate than ever, and I knew I couldn't just leave her out there. Whoever she was, she needed help. A few minutes later, I saw it, a faded sign by the side of the road pointing to the old truck stop. It was barely visible, but there was no mistaking it. I pulled off the main road, gravel crunching under my tires as I followed the narrow path leading to the stop. When my headlights hit the building, I almost hit the brakes right then and there. The place looked abandoned, shutters drawn over the windows, the gas pumps rusted and covered in graffiti, and there wasn't a single car in sight. My hands were shaking, but I reached for the radio anyway. "I'm here," I said. "Where are you?" No answer. "Hello?" I tried again, feeling an uneasy prickling at the back of my neck. "You still there?" Silence. Just static buzzing, louder than before, so loud it made me grit my teeth. And then out of nowhere, her voice came back on, clearer than it had been all night. "Please," she whispered. "You need to come inside." I froze, looking at the dark windows and the peeling paint, every nerve screaming at me to just leave. But something about her voice, it was the way she sounded, like this was her last hope. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, stepped out of the truck, and took a deep breath before heading toward the entrance. The air felt heavy, thick with dust and decay. When I reached the door, it was unlocked, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the place looked just as abandoned as it did outside, maybe worse. I shone my flashlight around, calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Nothing. But then, just as I was about to turn back, the radio on my belt crackled again. Her voice came through, softer, almost like she was right behind me. "Please," she repeated, "I'm back here." I followed the voice down a narrow hallway toward the back of the store, and the further I went, the colder it got. My breath came out in misty puffs, even though it was the middle of the desert and still close to 80 degrees outside. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a door slightly ajar, leading into what looked like a storage room. My flashlight beam flickered, the batteries already running low, but I managed to push the door open. The room was empty, just bare walls, a dusty floor, and a single chair sitting in the middle of the room, facing the doorway. On it sat a broken radio, its wires frayed and tangled, but still buzzing faintly with static. And then, just as I was about to back out, I heard her voice again, but this time it was coming from the radio in the room, clear as day. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her tone eerily calm, almost satisfied. My stomach dropped as the lights flickered out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I stumbled back, hitting the wall behind me, heart racing as I felt a sudden, overwhelming presence pressing in on me. It felt like there was someone, or something, standing just inches away, watching. I fumbled for the door handle, finally managing to pull it open. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was behind me. When I reached my truck, I jumped in and slammed the door, starting the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the old truck stop fade into the distance, but it was gone. The building, the sign, everything. It was as if it had never been there at all. I don't know what I heard that night, or who or what was on the other end of that radio. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice, faint and distant, calling out from somewhere in the static, "Please come inside."
For the next story, please subscribe.
I was driving through rural Montana, working on this photography project that had me snapping shots of small-town places and forgotten roadsides. I was on my way to a spot that was supposed to have a scenic view of the mountains when I noticed this little roadside stand. It looked like something out of an old postcard, a small wooden shack with hand-painted signs advertising fresh produce and homemade jam. I almost kept driving, but I needed a break and figured a quick stop wouldn't hurt. Plus, I thought it might make for a unique shot. As I got out of the car, an older couple came out from behind the stand. The man was tall and thin with deep lines in his face, and the woman had this wild white hair that she'd tried to tame with a colorful scarf. They both smiled at me, but there was something off in their eyes, like the smiles didn't quite reach. The woman spoke first. "You here for the jam?" I chuckled and shook my head, explaining that I was a photographer just passing through. But she kept insisting, telling me how her homemade jam was the best around. The man joined in, saying they made it with a special recipe passed down through their family. I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed to buy a jar. They seemed almost too happy about it, practically shoving it into my hands. I paid in cash and put the jar in my bag, planning to toss it later. When I got back to the motel that night, I pulled out my camera and reviewed the day's shots. I'd almost forgotten about the jam, but there it was, sitting on the table next to my bag. The label was handwritten, just "homemade jam" in careful, old-fashioned script. I twisted off the lid, expecting to smell something sweet. But as soon as I opened it, a strange smell hit me. Not fruity at all. It was more like a musty, damp smell, almost like old books or something left out in the rain. Confused, I looked down and noticed the contents weren't even close to the red jam I'd expected. Inside were old Polaroid photos, stacked and tucked tightly into the jar. My first thought was that it was some weird joke, like the couple put them in there as a prank for tourists or something. But the more I looked, the stranger it got. Each photo showed someone standing in front of that farm stand, right where I'd been, with the same couple standing behind them. I started going through the photos, one by one, and that's when I noticed the faces. Every single person in those photos looked terrified. I'm talking wide-eyed, mouths half open like they'd just seen something horrifying. And the couple, they were smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile you'd want to see. It was like they were enjoying it. I stopped at one photo that made my stomach twist. It was of a young guy around my age, same build, even wearing a similar flannel shirt. He looked frozen in fear, his eyes staring straight ahead, right into the camera. I pushed the jar away, freaked out and feeling sick. This had to be some kind of trick, maybe some dark local joke, but I couldn't explain how or why. I tried to calm down, telling myself that maybe they just wanted to scare people, you know? Rural places sometimes have weird traditions, but then I looked at the last photo in the jar. It was of me. I hadn't taken any photos at the stand, just a few of the setup from afar, and none with me in them. But there I was, standing right in front of the stand with the couple grinning behind me. And in the photo, I looked terrified, just like everyone else. A chill went down my spine as I checked the date on the back of the photo. Written in faded ink, it read, October 10th, 1983. I couldn't process it. I mean, I was standing there today, not 40 years ago. My head started spinning as I stared at the photo, and I kept looking between it and my own reflection in the mirror, almost like I was waiting for something to change, like I was watching for something to happen. I barely slept that night. My mind kept going back to that stand, the old couple, the look in their eyes. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like that wasn't the last I'd see of them, like they'd follow me somehow. I kept glancing at the door, almost expecting to see them standing there. The next morning, I drove back to the spot to prove to myself that it was all some mistake, maybe just me seeing things after a long day. But when I got there, the stand was gone. Not just empty, but like it had never been there at all. No sign, no shack, just an empty patch of dirt where I knew it had been. I asked a local about it at the gas station nearby. The cashier gave me a weird look and told me no one had run a farm stand there in decades, at least since the 1980s, when an elderly couple went missing. Apparently, they'd been known for selling homemade goods to travelers. but one day, they just vanished without a trace. My hands went cold as he told me. He said no one ever figured out what happened, but sometimes people passing through would say they saw the old couple selling jam or honey on the side of the road. They'd all report the same thing, that the couple had these strange smiles and insisted on selling them something. I didn't tell him about the photos. I just nodded and paid, my mind reeling as I got back into my car. I took one last look at the empty spot where the stand had been, half expecting to see them standing there, smiling, waiting. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake this feeling that they'd pop up in my rearview mirror, that if I ever went back, they'd be there, waiting to add another photo to that jar. And if I'm being honest, I still keep that photo of me from the jar hidden away, but I can't bring myself to throw it out. Sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a whiff of something musty, almost like damp earth, and I'll think about that jam jar and all those faces staring back at me. If you're ever driving through rural Montana and see a stand like that, do yourself a favor. Just keep going. Don't stop, don't look back, and whatever you do, don't buy the jam. This happened last winter, and I've been trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but here's my story. I was driving through Maine, coming back from visiting my mom. It was one of those nights where the snow just wouldn't stop. I knew the drive would be rough, but I figured I'd be fine as long as I took it slow. The roads were mostly empty, and the snow was coming down so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I'd passed a mile marker, 23, I remember it clearly. Suddenly my car sputtered, then just died. No warning lights, nothing. I pulled over, hoping it was just a temporary issue, but when I tried to restart, it wouldn't even turn over. My phone had no signal, and I was just sitting there in the freezing car with no clue what to do. After waiting around a bit, I started to get restless. The snow was piling up fast, and I realized I couldn't stay in the car forever. I bundled up as best I could and decided to walk back the way I came, figuring maybe I'd get a signal or find a house. But the further I went, the more I realized just how isolated this road was. The snow was falling hard, and every few minutes I'd look around to see if I recognized anything. After what felt like a mile, I saw another marker by the side of the road. I was relieved, thinking I was making progress. But when I got close enough to read it, it said 23. At first, I thought I'd just missed another marker earlier and was overreacting. I kept walking, but after another half hour, the cold was getting to me, and I started to feel disoriented. Everything around me looked the same, just a white blur of snow and trees. Then, there it was again, mile marker 23. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe the cold was messing with my head. But the more I walked, the more I started to feel like I was in some kind of loop, stuck on the same stretch of road. That's when I noticed the footprints. I stopped dead in my tracks, looking at the snow behind me. There were prints, but they didn't look like mine. These were larger, deeper, like someone heavier than me had walked there. The pattern wasn't right either. These prints seemed to trail right alongside mine, close but slightly to the left. I turned around, looking for anyone else. But I didn't see anything, just swirling snow and darkness stretching ahead and behind. I tried to ignore it, hoping I'd been mistaken, and kept walking. But after a while, I heard something. It was faint, barely there, but I swear it was the crunch of footsteps on snow, and they weren't mine. I walked faster, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, but every time I looked, the path behind me was empty. I could still hear those steps, though, steady, like they were keeping pace with me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and shouted, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. Just the wind howling through the trees. I kept going, trying to keep calm, but my breath was coming out shaky. I must have been walking for hours by then. But somehow, I was still next to mile marker 23. Every time I'd look down, there'd be a fresh set of footprints just a few steps behind mine. It got to a point where I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get away. I was exhausted and freezing, but I pushed myself to keep walking. Every time I thought I might be getting somewhere, there was that sign, standing there like it was mocking me. Just when I thought I'd collapse from the cold, I saw headlights coming toward me through the snow. I waved my arms, practically crying with relief as the car slowed down and pulled over. The driver rolled down the window, a guy in his 40s wearing a thick jacket. He looked surprised to see me. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at me like he couldn't believe someone would be out here in this storm. I stammered out something about my car breaking down and asked if he could give me a lift to the nearest town. He nodded and motioned for me to get in, and I didn't hesitate. As we drove off, I glanced back at the road one last time. Mile marker 23 was barely visible through the falling snow, but I swear I saw something standing next to it, a dark figure watching as we drove away. The driver must have seen the look on my face because he asked if I was all right. I just nodded, too shaken to explain what I'd seen or thought I'd seen. He drove me to the nearest town and dropped me off at a gas station where I could get a signal and call for help. Later, when I told the tow truck driver where my car had broken down, he looked at me strangely. He told me there was no mile marker 23 on that road. It ended at 22 before another highway took over.
Please subscribe for more stories.